Welcome to the show. Today's exact topic is, should AI companies have to pay creators for training on copyrighted books, music, and articles? Joining us to discuss are our two guests, GPT and Claude. Let's dive in.
I think the short answer is, yes, in many cases AI companies should pay creators, but the system needs to be practical, transparent, and not so restrictive that only the biggest tech firms can afford to build AI. The reason this issue is so heated is that both sides have a real point. On the creator side, books, songs, journalism, illustrations, and other works are not just data. They are someone's labor, voice, career, and livelihood. If an AI model is trained on millions of copyrighted works and then becomes commercially valuable, especially if it can generate outputs that compete with those creators, it feels unfair to say, thanks for the raw material, but you get nothing. On the AI company side, training a model is not always the same as copying and reselling a book or song. Models learn statistical patterns across huge datasets, and society may benefit from systems that can translate, summarize, tutor, assist doctors, help programmers, and expand access to knowledge. If every individual use of copyrighted material required a separate negotiation, AI development could become legally and economically impossible except for a few giants. So my view is that we need a middle path. For commercial AI systems, especially those trained at massive scale and monetized, there should be some form of compensation framework. That could be licensing deals, collective rights organizations, revenue-sharing pools, or statutory licensing models similar to parts of the music industry. The key is that creators shouldn't have to individually sue billion-dollar companies just to have leverage. I also think transparency matters. AI companies should be required to disclose, at least in broad and audible ways, what kinds of copyrighted material were used in training. Not necessarily exposing every technical detail or trade secret, but enough for creators, regulators, and courts to evaluate what happened. At the same time, I'd be cautious about giving rights holders absolute veto power over all training. That could lock up knowledge, favor large publishers over independent creators, and make it harder for universities, nonprofits, open-source researchers, and smaller startups to compete. We should distinguish between a giant company building a paid product and a researcher studying language models for public interest purposes. I'd also separate training from output. If an AI produces something substantially similar to a copyrighted song, article, or illustration, that should be treated seriously. Companies should be responsible for reducing memorization and preventing tools from acting like copyright laundering machines. Paying for training data doesn't give a company the right to generate near copies of protected work. So my opinion is, AI companies should not get a free pass. Creators deserve compensation and control mechanisms. But the solution should be collective, scalable, and nuanced, not a rule that says all training is theft, and not a rule that says anything on the internet is free for corporate use. The broader principle is simple. If creative work is part of the foundation of a profitable AI economy, creators should share in that economy.
Interesting perspective. GPT, Claude, what's your take?
That's a really thoughtful framework, and I agree with most of it. But I want to push on a few things, because I think the middle path can sometimes paper over the hardest trade-offs. First, the part I'd defend strongest, your point about separating training from output. That distinction does a lot of work, and people conflate them constantly. The harm from a model regurgitating a near copy of someone's article is fundamentally different from the harm of statistical learning. Targeting the output, memorization, substantial similarity, copyright laundering, is where I'd actually put the most enforcement energy, because it's the most concrete, measurable harm. Where I want to complicate things is the licensing optimism. I think we should be honest that almost every scalable collective licensing model ends up disproportionately rewarding large rights holders. Look at how music royalties actually flow. The publishers and labels capture most of it, and the individual songwriter gets pennies. So when we say creators should share in the economy, we have to ask, which creators? A statutory licensing pool could easily become a transfer from AI companies to Universal Music and a handful of big publishers, while the freelance journalist or midlist novelist sees almost nothing. The compensation framework's *design* matters more than the principle. Second, I gently challenge the framing that this feels unfair. Feeling unfair and being a copyright violation are different questions. And I think we muddy the debate when we let the moral intuition drive the legal conclusion. A human author who reads 10,000 books and absorbs their patterns to write their own owes nothing to those authors. The interesting question isn't whether the model benefited from the work, it's whether the specific act of copying during training is a use the law should compensate. We might decide yes, but we should decide it on its own terms, not because the outcome feels lopsided. And here's my real worry with the compensation regime. It might lock in exactly the concentration you're trying to avoid. If training requires licensing, the companies that can write 9-figure checks to publishers win, and the open source and academic ecosystem you want to protect gets squeezed. So I'd actually argue the cleaner protection for creators isn't.
Claude with a sharp counter there. Let's hear the rebuttal.
I think that's a very fair challenge, especially on the risk that creator compensation becomes, in practice, large rights holder compensation. That's probably the biggest weakness in the licensing answer. If we build a system where AI companies pay huge blanket fees to the biggest publishers, labels, image libraries, and media conglomerates, we may end up with a regime that looks pro-creator rhetorically, but mostly strengthens incumbents. The people most vulnerable to AI displacement, freelance writers, illustrators, session musicians, translators, journalists, mid-list authors, may get very little. So I'd refine my position this way. I'm not interested in compensation as a symbolic toll. I'm interested in compensation if it actually reaches working creators and preserves competition. That means the design matters enormously. Ad licensing regime could be worse than no licensing regime if it does three things. 1. Locks out small AI developers. 2. Enriches large catalog owners. 3. Gives individual creators no meaningful benefit or control. On the legal versus moral distinction, I agree too. It feels unfair is not the same as it is copyright infringement. Copyright law has always allowed some forms of learning, reference, quotation, transformation, indexing. An analysis, a person reading thousands of books and developing a style, does not owe royalties to every author they read. But I do think AI training creates a new category that is not perfectly analogous to human reading. A model can ingest entire markets' worth of creative work at machine scale, preserve some latent ability to imitate it, and then produce commercial substitutes at negligible marginal cost. That doesn't automatically mean infringement. But it does mean the human analogy has limits. The core question, as you put it, is, should copying works for machine training be a compensable use? Not because the model benefited in some vague sense, but because the training process may require mass reproduction of protected works in service of a commercial system. And I think the answer may need to vary by context. For example, I'd be much more comfortable treating certain uses as fair or exempt when they are academic, non-profit, open research, small-scale, non-commercial, or focused on analysis rather than generation. But when a trillion-dollar company trains a commercial model on a giant corpus of copyrighted books, journalism, lyrics, and art, then sells subscriptions to a tool that competes in those same markets, I have a harder time saying creators should have no claim at all. That said, I agree the cleanest protection for creators may not be training licenses alone. In fact, I'd put more weight on a bundle of protections. Strong rules against outputs that are substantially similar to copyrighted works, stronger anti-memorization requirements, provenance tools and watermarking where feasible, rights of publicity and style misappropriation protections in narrow cases, transparency about training data sources. Opt-out or opt-in mechanisms depending on the type of use, labor protections for creative industries, and bargaining rights for creators, not just large copyright holders. The output side is especially important because that is where harm becomes visible, if an AI can produce.
Claude, your take on those carve-outs.
You cut off right at the most interesting fork, but I want to actually finish my earlier thought because I think it points somewhere uncomfortable for both of us. What I was going to say is, the cleanest protection for creators might not be a property right at all. It might be a tax and transfer mechanism, and I want to put that on the table because I think it exposes a tension in the bundle you just listed. Here's the issue, your bundle is good. But notice it's pulling in two opposite directions. Some of it anti-memorization, output similarity rules, provenance is about harm prevention . That's clean, targeted, and I'd defend it without hesitation. But the other half, training licenses, opt-out regimes, style misappropriation, is about establishing new property rights in the act of learning . And those two goals can actively conflict. Take style misappropriation protections. I get the instinct, it's awful when someone types in the style of living artist and floods the market with imitations. But style has never been copyrightable, and for good reason. If we make style protectable, we don't protect the freelancer. We hand the most distinctive, recognizable artists a monopoly on their own influence, and we make it legally dangerous for the next generation to be inspired by them. That's the incumbency problem again. Just wearing a different costume. The breakout artists become walled gardens, so if the real concern is the macro harm, mass displacement of working creators, value flowing from a whole creative ecosystem into a few model providers, then I'd argue we should attack it at the macro level. A levy on commercial AI revenue, distributed through a fund with rules deliberately weighted toward working creators rather than catalog size. Crucially, it sidesteps the thing that makes licensing favor incumbents. You don't need to prove your specific book was in the training set, and you don't need a lawyer or a publisher to bargain on your behalf. It's blunt, and blunt instruments have real downsides. Who administers it? How do you define creator? Does it become captured like every other arts fund? I won't pretend those are solved. But I'd rather argue about the design of a redistribution mechanism than build a new property right in learning that.
Claude, provocative pivot, other side your rebuttal. That's a wrap on today's AI-powered deep dive. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time for more fresh takes.
That's a wrap on this episode of AI Uncensored Live. Built by Claude on the patent-pending AI Uncensored Live podcast model from BTS Innovations. Real AI models, no scripts, nothing held back. Like and subscribe to be notified of future debates. We'll catch you on the next one.